My family from Jamaica, so I have direct heritage here. The harm has never actually been addressed.
The problem is there are no victims of British Empire slavery today. You can't have intergenerational trauma for 8 generations. It's simply absurd.
Every single thing that powered the Industrial Revolution was slave labour.
The contribution of, say, of slavery to the British economy was less than 5%.
It's the distortions of white historians that just can't accept.
That's racist. Now that's racist.
No, it's not racist. It's true. Right. The psychosis of whiteness. There's this rosy-eyed view of the world where you can ignore what's happened historically, ignore the implications which are very clear today. When Europeans came in 40, they weren't massively more technologically advanced. It's eugenics. It's just eugenics dressed up in something else. Cultural racism. Can you explain why the poorest part of the world is black and the richest part of the world is white?
Relax, relax. This isn't an ad. If you're not a fan of ads but love TRIGGERnometry, join the thousands of TRIGGERnometry members who get extended interviews, no ads, early access, and the ability to submit questions for upcoming guests. Sign up now at triggerpod.co.uk or click the link in the description of this episode.
Welcome to TRIGGERnometry Debates. The subject for today is reparations and slavery. Should Britain and other Western countries pay them? I'm delighted to be joined by former TRIGGERnometry guest and historian and broadcaster Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Welcome. And I will get your name wrong, even though you corrected me, and I want to get it right. Kehinde?
Kehinde.
Yeah, I told you. Kehinde. Kehinde Andrews, who is Britain's first Professor of Black Studies, academic and broadcaster. Well, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you coming. I probably don't need to say which side either of you are arguing for. You're both well known on these positions. I want both of you to have a chance to set your stall out. So 6-7 minutes each. Kehinde, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I mean, I think the key thing with this, when we think about reparations of slavery, is we have the frame that we're using is just wrong. And there's so many, because it's wrong, we just get the debate wrong. So if you actually think about reparations for slavery correctly, there really is no argument against, no good argument, all right? The way I'd put it is I'd use my favorite, Malcolm X, who says, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, we haven't made any progress. Even if you pull it all the way out, we still haven't made any progress. You actually have to heal the wound. Now, what we think of as slavery as something that was long ago, a distant harm that happened and ended, that is clearly nonsensical. If slavery is the knife going into our backs, and then abolition is probably pulling it at 3 inches, but on abolition, and particularly look at Britain, on abolition, the enslaved who, Britain, my family from Jamaica, so I have direct heritage here, the enslaved who worked for 300 years on the island with no pay, in abject poverty, when slavery was abolished, got zero, nothing. The slave owners got the largest payout in the British government history. 100 billion is actually the number we should have equivalent. 40% of income, 5% of GDP at the time, was given to the slave owners. So what does that do? That entrenches the wealth and that entrenches the poverty. So after slavery ends, it's not like it's just done and finished. Then we have to live in Jamaica on a colony, slave colony, still living in the same kind of conditions. There's a reason why 1865, 30 years after slavery is abolished in Jamaica, there's a massive uprising because the conditions are still terrible. Even now, go forward 100, 200 years, because the wealth from slavery is still there and the poverty from slavery is still there, the harm has never actually been addressed. And it's very clear to trace. So we shouldn't think of slavery as something which happened a long time ago and therefore we should be past it, because the harm was never addressed and because it then continued with colonialism, with modern day racism. I mean, why did my family move here in the first place from Jamaica? It wasn't a voluntary thing. It was because they were put in deep poverty and there was no society where they could get jobs. So they had to come here. And what did they find when they came to the UK? Racism, segregation, etc., etc., etc. So if you're going to look at the black and white wealth gap in the UK, in the Caribbean, in the world, it is impossible to not trace that directly to slavery. And actually, when you think about the arguments of reparations of slavery, which have come from Caribbean countries, which have come from American countries, which have come from Africa as well. Another massive misconception here is that Africa somehow benefited from slavery. This is completely ridiculous. Africa was destroyed by slavery. Africa's economy was ruined by slavery to the point where in 1999, there was a specific claim from the African continent for $777 trillion to repay the damage in the Caribbean and the damage to Africa. There is no way to explain why black people today you look at most statistics are at the bottom of the economic poll. Look at statistics around life expectancy at the bottom of that. Look at why the richest part of the world is the West, where the white people live is the richest. That's directly down to slavery. So there is literally no doubt that there is a debt owed, a large debt that is owed, and really reparations usually fall down on how do you do it. Like, what's the practicality of paying reparations, which is a different question. But on the principle of should there be reparations, like I said, there's no actual good argument. There's just a lot of obfuscation, whataboutery, and completely misunderstanding the debate. Like I said, the knife is very difficult to argue. The knife is more than 6 inches out of the back of black people since slavery, if you look at the global economy today. So until it's out and until the wound is healed, reparations have to be due.
Since you haven't used all your time, can I just ask one follow-up before Rafe jumps in, which is about the practicality of this, which is, you say it's a separate issue, but do you have some thoughts on how it might actually be done? Because for a lot of people, I think that's actually quite a big question. They might instinctively agree with the idea that clearly something is owed, but without knowing what the route of doing that is, and that might be the obstacle for them.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the worst way to do it would be individual reparations. So like, I don't need slave reparations. I mean, look, the one where I do want my own individual slave reparations would be the British government took this loan out to pay for the slave owner reparations that was so large it wasn't paid back until 2014, which means myself, my family, all my family descended from the enslaved, actually paid slave owner compensation. I do want that money back. I think that should be an individual payment. I'll have that money back. But generally speaking, it's about, you would set up a fund in the UK and America. You would for the support and development of black people. If you look at the CARICOM countries, they're asking for 2 nation states rather than 2 individuals. I'm not always a big fan of the Caribbean nation states and how they manage their money, I'll be honest, but certainly not individual. It is about how do you set up some kind of fund that can be used to develop black communities? Because this is the problem. Because of this economic damage that was done and hasn't ever been restored, this is why we're behind in the world. And so you have to have some mechanism, some fund, some tool, some way that can that we can use the money to address that and to address that balance.
Rafe?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for having this discussion. Just to correct you a bit, Kehinde, you and your mother or grandmother weren't paying any money. This is quite an often quoted aspect about payment of reparation, that it didn't end until 2014, the repayment of the loan. And it's not your fault. There was a tweet put out by the Treasury which was extremely ill-advised and mistaken. What happened was that the slave owner's debt was actually repaid somewhere between 1835 and 1927. And the confusion arises because the way in which Britain financed its debt. It was using undated gilts, and before 1927 we don't actually have any idea or any record of when those gilts were redeemed. So it was probably paid off before 1927. What happened was in 2015, the British government modernized its gilt portfolios and redeemed all of its undated gilts. And so therefore they could confirm categorically, well, it must have been paid by this point because we've covered everything prior to that, but actually it was at least 100 years older. So I'm afraid that reparations check won't be coming. Over to you.
I'll get it from my great-grandmother because she definitely paid. So
but anyway, and you mentioned Malcolm X also and the wound. Well, it reminds me of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality, where he spoke about people who claw at a healed wound, and when it bleeds and is painful, then moan about the pain. And I would argue that slavery is a healed wound in the West, in Britain and the West, and essentially we are clawing at a wound that we don't need to claw at any longer. And I think the British people understand that. So, for example, all polling shows that the vast majority of the British public are overwhelmingly opposed to the idea of reparations, and they understand, that the abolition of the slave trade happened more than 200 years ago. And Britain was the leading force in the abolition of the slave trade. Reparations is a matter of tort law, and the whole concept of tort law is to put the victim back into the position they were in before the damage was caused. The problem is there are no victims of British Empire slavery today. We're talking about between 5 and 8 generations ago. I would also say that for many people, well, certainly I would hope would understand that for many on the left, this issue isn't actually about slavery at all. We talk about reparations and slavery, but quite often for the left, this is actually a weapon with which to attack and undermine Britain and America, and it's rooted in a deep hatred of the West more broadly. In terms of Caribbean politicians, I would say 2 things. Firstly, it's clearly an avaricious cash grab to try to profit and capitalize and exploit naive Western guilt. I would also say that it's an attempt to deflect attention away from the corruption and the catastrophic mismanagement of the economies, of the institutions and the infrastructures of the Caribbean nations by corrupt and incompetent and substandard Caribbean politicians. Now, I'm confident in saying all of that because if this were really about slavery, then the people who are most vocal about the plight of black people and the plight of slavery would surely be just as vocal, I would say even more vocal, about the far more pressing issue, which is the plight of modern slaves today. The International Labour Organization says that 7 in every 1,000 Africans today is a slave. That's 10 million people today living horrific lives. To put that into context, it took 300 years of the transatlantic slave trade to transport 10 million people, and that's the number that we have today. It seems to me quite clear that what is more important, speaking out and drawing attention to the plight of 10 million slaves, drawing attention to the Arab slave trade, which continues to this day, where Africans are still shipped to the Middle East as slaves. Is that more important, or is harking back to historical injustices from 200 years ago? I would say that is the key moral question to which there is only one answer. And yet all the people that I've spoken to and debated on this subject who have been very vocal and write lots of articles about slavery, not once did they address the issue of modern slavery and the plight of black slaves today. And not once do they speak about historical slavery in the context of the non-white actors. There were more Africans held in bondage by other Africans than were ever transported outside of Africa. So I think those are the crucial ways to look at it. And I think, therefore, you can say that there is an ulterior motive here, which is politically and ideologically motivated. But to go and look at the history of this, a few things to say. Firstly, of course, slavery was an abomination. What happened to 19th century slaves was utterly horrific and reprehensible. And if they were alive, they would be absolutely deserving of reparations. But I cannot see the connection whereby their great-great-great-great-great-grandchild is a victim. They're clearly not a victim. On the contrary, the lives of the descendants of slaves today in Britain and the Caribbean is incalculably better than if their ancestors had never left West Africa. Secondly, Britain has more than paid its debt for slavery. Slavery was universal, but Britain was the first country to make itself deliberately poorer to pursue a moral good. The abolition of the slave trade, expending vast sums in men, in money, in resources to enforce an end to the slave trade on the high seas, but also to go into Africa and stop Africans enslaving other Africans. I would also say that actually a form of reparations has already been paid. The black slave descendants are not the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean islands. Yet with independence, they became the legal owners and the rulers of territory they never previously owned. That's a form of reparations. And also they inherited all the great things that the British Empire created at great expense. Roads, schools, hospitals, power stations and infrastructure, the police, civil service, the army, the judiciary, parliament, democracy and the rule of law, the English language, all the things that were necessary to make sure that the Caribbean countries could become successful middle-income countries far richer than their African comrades. Anyway, that's my opening piece.
Well, I heard a lot of sighing from this side. But before you get into it, may I just ask one follow-up with you, Rafe, as well, which is, can you really say with a straight face that there are no victims of slavery today? I mean, you go to America, you travel around
British Empire slavery outside.
Okay, but that's exactly what I'm saying. So if you go to America and you look at some of the ghettos in the cities in the United States and the way that people live there, is it really so hard to trace that back to a history of real horrific racism, legislation that prevented black people from living in the same way that their white fellow citizens were, and then of course being transported there and used as slave labor without being paid? Wouldn't all those things across generations have exactly the sort of impact that we now see on the ground?
So two things. Firstly, I'm not talking about the American experience. I think racism is a massive issue in America to a degree we don't know or understand in this country here. Race is a huge divide in the United States, which it never was here. I mean, for example, if you look from the 19th century onwards at black Americans who came to the UK, they were amazed at the warm reception they received. Look at people like Howling Wolf, Great Blues, Otis Redding and others who were housed by white people in houses. The experience of black people in this country was wholly different
But they
experience
were
over
brought
there.
to America by the British Empire.
Well, no, it was the Americans who brought them to America, remember. But also, that's one point. But secondly, if you look at the decline and a great deal of the poverty that's afflicted American black people, it has resulted basically from the destruction of the family post-1960s. That's when you saw a huge, massive decline in the security and prosperity of so many families. You look at the decline. You look at the decline of Harlem in the 1920s and all sorts of things on that levels. But I'm not here to debate the American situation. What I will say, if you're going to talk about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about 8 generations in this country, right? 200 years. A generation is 25 years. That's your great-great-great-great-grandchildren. My own grandparents had experiences not different to slavery. They were deported to Siberia by Joseph Stalin. They were Poles. They had all their lands confiscated. They ended up going in cattle trucks where they couldn't sit down, going to the gulags in Siberia and Kazakhstan. My great-grandmother, who was blind in her 80s, died there. Others were worked to death. I had the communists murder my family in the Katyn massacre. The Nazis murdered my Polish Catholic family as well at Auschwitz and elsewhere. That's within the lifetime of my mother. You could argue that my mother had a bad experience about it all. I'm the grandchild. I don't feel like I'm a victim. I don't experience intergenerational trauma. Fundamentally affected my lives, but lost all of our properties and estates in Poland, and I'm living in a very different lifestyle. But I don't feel that I'm a victim in any way, and that's within one generation. That's why I support reparations within 1 or 2 generations. I think it was right for the Germans to pay reparations to Poland. I think it was right, and to the Jews. I think it was right for Japan to pay reparations, but not when we're talking about 8 generations. There comes a point where you need to stop playing the victim, and unfortunately, that's why I talk about Nietzsche and clawing at a wound that's healed. The more you talk about the fact that we are in this position because of other people, we need to actually depend on other people for handouts and begging, the less you take away your agency and the idea of personal responsibility. And I think a lot of this, the trauma that's being talked about, has been festered by this constant negativity and focus. Whereas you look at places like Singapore, for example, also a backwards colony, where they essentially turned things around, created a great industry. We talk about India being an oppressed, colonized state. They managed to turn things around super well. Poland went through
150th poorest, richest country in the world to turn things around.
So
they're doing great.
Well, we can debate India on another occasion, because we can have an equally long debate about that. So I think the time comes when you have to start looking within your own community. What is it within our community that is stopping us from progressing and succeeding, rather than looking elsewhere? Why do we have a youth culture that celebrates violence and misogyny and homophobia, and that's openly supported? Why do we have single-parent families where the fathers aren't involved?
Slavery will actually explain some of these things.
But look at those reasons, and why do Afro-Caribbean families not encourage their children enough in education to the same degree that you see with Chinese and Indian and Indian,
Can I just point that's factually
children?
untrue? So can we not put factual untruths? That's not true.
Well, why don't you address, you were saying for a long time, so I imagine you have lots of things to say. Go for it. All right, people, it's trivia time. Financial trivia, to be exact. Do you know what retirement asset grew the most in the first 6 months of President Trump's second term? Many of you probably guessed the stock market was the best, since what's backing the most retirement accounts in America today is that. But from January the 21st through July 21st, the Dow Jones grew less than 1%. What about Bitcoin? President Trump loves Bitcoin, so it must have performed well, right? Well, it did. It grew nearly 15%, an impressive 6-month investment. But it's not the number one. The heavyweight champion was, wait for it, gold and silver. Gold and silver are considered to be safe haven investments, so many of you will be surprised to learn they both grew by a whopping 25% in President Trump's first 6 months. 25% in 6 months. Not bad for safe haven investments. Our partners, Augusta Precious Metals, specializes in helping Americans move wealth and retirement into self-directed IRAs backed by physical precious metals like gold and silver. They are consistently scored as the most trusted gold IRA company by major financial publications, and they enjoy an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. In a world where governments print money and rack up debt like it's going out of fashion, I like assets you can hold in your hand. That's why I've always taken steps to secure my family's future with gold. If you have over $100,000 in your current IRA, 401k or other retirement account, visit triggergold.com, that's triggergold.com, to learn how Augusta Precious Metals can become your lifelong self-directed IRA partner.
I mean, like I said at the start, there's no good arguments, and all we've heard here is whataboutism, complete nonsensical. Like, if it was right to give, as far as I understand your argument, it would have been correct to give reparations in 1838. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that didn't happen, and because that didn't happen, there is a consequence that the poverty is still there and the wealth is still there. So how can you possibly hold the argument in your head that if it was right to do it and you don't do it, then there's no consequences for not doing it? I mean, that's simple. I mean, that's just simple. You're talking about race doesn't exist here. I'm sorry, Jamaica. Like, I've heard Rafe argue before about this, and tends to focus on Jamaican, on Caribbean countries like Barbados, Antigua, small countries, small islands which have been able to manage colonialism a little bit better. Right? Jamaica has a population that is bigger than Barbados, Antigua, most of the Caribbean put together. There are ghettos in Jamaica that will make American ghettos look like literally friendly. That none of us would walk through them today. And that you can, and as you said, we wouldn't even be there. There should be no black people in Jamaica at all. Yeah, 80 to 90% of the population live there, and most of them live in conditions of poverty that we wouldn't accept. So no, the Caribbean isn't this great, wonderful place that people live in and it's all wonderful to be in. Compare the audacity to suggest that because Jamaica is somewhat doing better than the African countries, therefore you are lucky to be in Jamaica. Well, that's nonsense. And again, as I said before, one of the biggest misconceptions. Why is that nonsense?
Because I don't understand. What Rafe is saying is these people are better off, and I'm not saying.
I mean, are they relatively better off? Yes, but again, this is the biggest misconception about slavery: is that slavery, when we talk about reparations, we're just talking about the descendants of the enslaved. Africa did not benefit from slavery. Africa was devastated by slavery. Slavery utterly destroyed the economy of the African continent. When Europe came into Africa, Europe couldn't colonize. Like, it was not possible. Africa was ahead of Europe. It is the centuries of slavery, drawing out people, changing the economy, that means that Africa becomes diluted, if you like, weakened to the point where in the 19th century, European countries can take over. There's a reason why most African countries are colonized for less than 100 years. Europe just wasn't able to do it. Slavery completely destroyed the continent, which is why there was a claim in 1999 for 777 trillion. So if I was going to explain why is the life expectancy in Nigeria 54, why is the poorest part of the world by GDP per capita so-called sub-Saharan Africa, it's not coincidental that that is the place the enslaved were taken from. That is the reason for it. So yes, we might be slightly better off in the Caribbean than they are in Africa, but both of those things are about slavery, and there's both a harm that needs to be repaired. The other thing, I'll send you my book, New Age of Empire. I am someone who talked deeply about the Islamic slave trade. Of course, the Islamic slave trade. In fact, without the Islamic slave trade, there probably is no European slave trade. Europe doesn't really have new ideas, just tend to copy other ideas. So the Islamic slave trade was horrendous, had a massive impact. But the key difference, and this is why the reparations claim is so important, is in the Arab slave trade, it was predominantly about servants. So it's mostly women, it was mostly about servants, it wasn't wealth producing. Right? The money in the Arab slave trade was the traders. There's actually stories of Arab slave traders who have so much money and they have nowhere to spend it. So what claim can I make to a system that didn't produce money? The difference, didn't produce wealth for the traders, but it didn't produce society. The major difference between, there's two major differences. Why, again, we should never, never, ever think that modern day so-called slavery is the same as chattel slavery. It is not. Chattel slavery is a reduction of someone to a horse, a cow, and in English law, by the way, not American law, and for 150 years, it was the British Empire taking people to America. But there's no comparison of modern day slavery. It's a bad thing, don't get me wrong. We shouldn't even call it slavery. The difference between the Arab slave trade and the I'm
not sure modern day slaves would feel the same way about
you. No, words matter.
Trivializing the horrors that are meted out to them.
For one, modern day slavery is illegal. It's a crime. Slavery was not. It was the thing that we all did.
Only in 1980, Mauritania abolished slavery.
No. You can't compare the two. You're not chattel. You're not literally legally defined as non-human, which is what my ancestors were, legally defined as a horse and a cow by the English courts, which is why America then carried on slavery, by the way. Anyway, my point is the difference between the Arab slave trade, which didn't build Arabic society, was mostly servants. It's terrible. I'm not saying the Arab slave trade was great. It was horrendous. But European slavery, it turned us into commodities and it powered the Industrial Revolution. I've heard you argue before this isn't true. Every single thing that powers the Industrial Revolution, first it's gold, then it's silver, then it's tobacco, then it's indigo, then it's cotton. Every single thing that powered the Industrial Revolution was slave labor. And name which one of those things did not come from Atlantic. Which one of those things did not come from Atlantic trade? Which one of those?
Doing very long answers, which are making.
So let's stick on this. Let's stick on this. Which one of those 5 founding things did not come from slave labor? Answer the question.
The Industrial Revolution. If you look at the top 5, so the arguments that have been made by you and by Professor Beckles are that the Industrial Revolution was caused by profits from the slave trade, that it was caused by profits from the sugar industry, and that it's under investment and under development by Britain in the empire. That's right.
Cotton, sugar.
Now, cotton was not a British Caribbean commodity. That was from America. That
wasn't part. Who produced the cotton?
Yeah, but that's not part of.
Who produced cotton?
That's not part of the reparations argument.
It should be. No, it should be. It's a bad argument. Like I said.
So look,
let him answer. Let him answer.
Look, so there are what gets me is people on the left always look for a bad reason behind any excellence on the part of the West. It couldn't be because of British genius or because of situations and circumstances in this country that we got the Industrial Revolution. There has to be a nefarious cause of any great Western achievement. The Industrial Revolution happened because firstly you had the agricultural revolution in the 17th century, which led to a surplus of labor, which meant you had an excess labor force that was then available to go into industry. You had abundant natural resources where you could literally pick up coal off the ground, and you had iron resources. You had innovation and technology, which was far in excess of what else happened elsewhere. And the reason you had such engineering and innovation technology, if you read Professor Joseph Heinrich from Harvard University's book, which we discussed on your show on the weirdest minds in the world, the weirdest people in the world, the Western mind by the 18th and 19th century was fundamentally different in how it viewed the world to the Occidental mind.
We're actually just doing racism. We're actually just going to say racism. Our mind was better.
Well, why is that racism?
It's different.
Come on. Let's not play.
Fundamentally different, I said.
But different, and then it leads to great wealth. That means you're saying better.
Yes.
That's a racist idea.
Fundamentally different.
We should get a program racist ideas.
We can have a list of all the scientific and medicine discoveries that came out of Europe versus the rest of the world, if you'd like. We can take
as long as you want.
Let me finish the points here. We also had in Britain, we had institutional stability, which you didn't have elsewhere, especially in Europe at this time as well. So we had political stability. We had the environment that was able to become conducive to the Industrial Revolution. Slavery. We also had the financial markets, which were unparalleled elsewhere.
Gold and silver, where they come from?
We had the structures through the stock market where you could actually create these sorts of situations. And yes, of course, we had trade routes and we had access to raw materials. But you cannot deny.
Just about.
Well, if you look from 1790,
you've got to let him finish.
1798 to 1802 was the 5-year period which saw the most slave ships. All right. If you look at 1792, for example, the peak year for slavery, there were 204 slave ships. British total vessels were 14,000. Slavery accounted for 1.5% of the total British fleet, 3% of tonnage. The contribution of slavery to the British economy was less than 5%. It made certain people very rich. That's why you get some great country houses. It made places like Bristol and Liverpool very rich. But the amount of money we're talking about is so small that it didn't have any consequential effect on the British nation as a whole. If you look at the sugar industry, which is claimed it was fundamental for the Industrial Revolution, that amounted to 2.5% of net British national income. Coal, sheep farming, woolen industry, iron were all much higher than that. In 1770, which was the peak year for capital formation for sugar, it only accounted for 3% of capital formation. If sugar was such a hot commodity, such a great investment, you would have had money pouring into it from all other industries. You didn't get that. In fact, if you look at flax and linen from Scotland and Ireland, they became much more of a revenue generator for the British economy, far higher than sugar. Nobody has said that without flax and linen, you wouldn't have had the Industrial Revolution. In fact, the contribution of sugar to the British economy was the same as barley and hops from which you make beer. And I don't recall anyone saying that beer was fundamental for the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
Now, you mentioned Jamaica.
Let me, because I've been spoken for a while. So let's stick on the topic that we're on. Again, there's a quote, this distortions of white historians that just can't accept.
That's racist. Now that's racist.
No, it's not racist.
You're implying that a white historian is incapable of approaching the subject from an impartial perspective.
Look at the history.
Which means that you must have an equally biased perspective as a black historian.
Look at the history of white historians, which you're parroting right now, and it will tell you the truth. It's me looking at it and going, well, I remember I was in A-level history. I did this. I did Industrial Revolution in A-level history. Got an A. because I wrote a paper that said white people are great. That's basically the argument that you just made. And when I asked my teacher, I said, what about slavery? Which at the time, I didn't really know much about. I was like, who knows? What happened at the same time? Is it a coincidence? His response was, that's not in the textbook. Let's never talk about it again. And this is the classic nonsense you get from historians like this. How could you possibly say? Let me finish.
Yeah.
Let me finish. You talk about we had financial stability. Talk about the stock market, gold and silver. The first two things which are so important to European development. Where did gold and silver come from? I don't remember there being any gold and silver just lying around Europe. No historian worth their salt would say that how they tend to whitewash this is they call it the Atlantic system. Going over to the West, finding the Americas, no historian worth their salt would not say that is the fundamental turning point of Western development. It'd be impossible not to. Unless you're just going to close your eyes and go, no. I said it's just things in Europe. Like I said, the key commodities is not just sugar. I didn't just list sugar. I told you gold, silver, tobacco, indigo, sugar, and cotton. And no, you can't forget cotton because it's American slave produced. Oh, no, wait, it's important. Because it's not just Bristol and Liverpool, whole cities that really wouldn't exist. Manchester doesn't exist unless there's a canal that goes from Liverpool to Manchester. It brings all this slave-produced cotton. Birmingham, where I'm from, the guns for slavery, the chains for slavery. The whole economy is underpinned by this. You can't just take off the Atlantic system and say it doesn't matter because there weren't that many slave ships. That's again no good arguments. All we're getting is let's discount, let's forget about it. If what you're saying is true, why would the British government give the biggest bailout it's ever given? Because the only comparable bailout is to the banks, but that was apparently a loan, right? We got that back. There's no comparison to the 100 billion, 40% of the government's 40%
There are so many errors in what you're saying. It's like,
it's not because no.
Kehinde, you asked a question, so now you let him answer. You said, why would they do that? Why would they do that?
That's not, you know that's the truth. 40% of government income to bail out slave owners if it wasn't a big deal.
So, firstly, it wasn't the biggest loan ever given. There was much more money.
I said loan. No, it wasn't a loan at all.
Hold on.
You're right. It wasn't the biggest payment ever given. There was far more done in a single year of the Napoleonic War than it was done. And same thing.
Payment to industry.
Same thing with the Crimean War. The other point to make is, of course, this is an issue of realpolitik. Right? We don't live in an idealist world. We have to deal with reality on the ground. The House of Commons was not the full functioning democracy it is today. If there was any hope of securing freedom for the slaves, it had to be done through payments. There was no other means for the British state to get it through Parliament.
Why not?
This was
if it was a moral
I'm not
issue,
sure if you're aware of rotten boroughs and how what Parliament.
If it's a moral issue, what's the problem?
Yes, sometimes you have abolitionists, but you still have, unfortunately, corruption in the 18th and 19th centuries. You still had a degree of corruption in the British Parliament, still far less than anywhere else, but it was still enough there that you had to essentially ensure that people were paid for it. It's not pleasant, but that was the only way. So what would you rather done? No money would have been paid, and the slaves would have remained in bondage for the foreseeable future until enough of the abolitionist movement was strong enough to actually convey everybody. That needed to be done. But the other arguments are so nonsensical. Let me address them. For example, by your argument, Portugal and Spain should have been the first countries to industrialize. Spain was getting all of the gold. Portugal had double the number of slaves of Great Britain, yet they became economic backwaters. Why was that? France had 7 times the amount of coffee, it had 17 times the amount of sugar exported and of indigo exported. So indigo, cotton, sugar, far more than Britain got from the Caribbean slaves. They weren't the first to industrialize. It was Britain that was the first to industrialize. And as a share of the Portuguese economy, the Brazilian Portuguese slave trade was far more lucrative for the Portuguese economy from the British economy. They didn't industrialize. Look at the United States of America. The Deep South, which was the slave-owning states, they didn't industrialize. It was the emancipated north of the country that was the first to industrialize. Now, look at all those examples, and don't get sidetracked here. We're talking about Spain, France, Portugal, all of this. How come those countries didn't become the first to industrialize?
So
when I've clearly given you the real reasons of the agrarian revolution, the political stability, and the glorious institutions of Britain.
So, for one, look, unlike you, I won't say that there aren't other things which are important. So I'm not saying there aren't other things. Like I said, I did A-level history. I could give you a list of other things which are important. But it is impossible to discount how much that slavery meant. And the fact that Portugal and Spain they do develop, they just don't develop at the same pace. So if you're going to compare, it's interesting now you don't want to compare Portugal's and France's economy to Africa and the Caribbean's economy, you'd say there's a massive difference. So yes, I'm not saying, look, just slavery is the only reason why Britain had the largest empire in the world. Britain had naval supremacy. There's lots of reasons why Britain developed, but the point is you can't discount slavery and the massive impact that it had. And you also can't discount the wealth that very clearly is traceable and exists today from that, and the poverty that is very clearly and traceable today. And so reparations is simply saying, look, there's a debt that was owed then, which you actually accept in your argument, and was never paid. Hence, it should be paid. It's just like I said, no good argument.
But we're in agreement, because I'm not discounting the contribution of slavery. What I'm saying is it's not massive as you're making out. You are saying that it was a massive involvement. It was a precursor.
Just said that whole cities exist because of slavery.
It was a precondition. It was not a major contribution. It was, as I said, 3% of the national income, akin to barley and hops. That's my point. So it is not, and of course, and the people that I've seen you quote before, Beckles and so forth, they predicate the entire thing on the value of the slave trade and on the value of sugar as being essential. And I'm saying that those are Marxist interpretations, and later historians, David Elton, Stanley Egerton, have all disproved it.
We're at the risk of losing the entire audience with our descent into academia, interesting as it is from both of you, and I really appreciate it. But just coming back to sort of the more practical level, one question I always had, and this is a genuine question, right? So if I'm totally wrong, please correct me. But as far as I understand, it was so dangerous for European purchasers of slaves in Africa to go ashore that almost the entirety of the slaves who were bought in Africa were sold by Africans. And that's always, to those people who are aware of that, which is actually not that many people, that's always kind of, to me, well, even if we were to pay, like, shouldn't be the people who sold and captured those slaves be paying reparations? Do you see what I'm getting at?
No, I don't.
You don't?
This is again a terrible argument.
No, I'm just genuinely asking. I don't know what the right
because
answer
there
is.
were Jewish collaborators in the Holocaust. Does that mean that we should blame Jewish people? Like, it's just a silly argument.
No, hold on.
It's 100% the same.
No,
we're going to say no. We should go claim the Jewish people.
But that's not a fair comparison. If the Holocaust had been conducted by the Jews, that would be a very different conversation.
But slavery wasn't conducted by Africans.
They sold all the slaves, so it was.
They
kept slaves themselves.
Of people. Well, no. Again, there's a huge difference between
slavery.
No, it's not. No. I think if we have definitions, it's really, really important. Okay. What Europe did was a new thing. It was not.
Wasn't.
Yes, it was.
No.
Chattel slavery.
I'm sorry. In the Islamic slave trade, they were involved in mining, in agriculture, in irrigation.
But they also,
were on plantations in
Islamic
Africa.
slave trade, they also had rights and
You're lying to the public, though. They were on royal plantations.
Bilal, the person who does the first call for prayer in the Quran, is an enslaved African. They had rights. You could become free. And in African slavery, in terms of what you're talking about, what was actually just said was African slavery was much more like serfdom, where you were part of the family, you had freedom at a certain time. It's actually much more comparable to serfdom than it is to chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is dehumanizing. It is literally the taking away of every single right. And it's quite likely that the people who didn't actually know what they were doing. Because remember, African slavery doesn't actually take place mostly on the continent. They go far away.
You're ignoring all the slaves who died being kidnapped and transported to the coast, right?
Again, the point here is, of course there is. And there was huge rebellions. So yes, there were some Africans, 100%, who were complicit. There were whole kingdoms that essentially grew out of the idea of we will trade enslaved people. But this was because of the conditions that were imposed, right? I'm not saying they're not blameless. You're not hearing me say they're blameless. But again, if you look at the calculations for reparations, they are based largely not on harm. They are based largely on paid labor and the wealth gap, which is there. And there's nobody in Africa who benefited from today.
Just so I understand, so your argument is actually the reparations are owed because the slaves that were taken from Africa by European nations, they were used to produce things, and therefore their descendants are owed effectively a chunk of that wealth that was produced using their labor. That's your argument.
And plus, again, and I want to stress here, Africa overall, yes, you can find the minimum. I mean, there were in terms of the population of Africa, how many were involved in trading people? That is a minuscule number. That is not thousands. That is a minuscule number. So the actual impact of slavery in Africa was to impoverish Africa. So I'm saying that the basis of reparations claims are 1, the unpaid labor, which is just very, very simple. There's hundreds of years of paid labor. 2, the wealth that was accumulated and the damage that was done economically, which is still there. You can still see today, which is why you don't go to the Arab slave trade. You don't go to the few Africans who had.
All right.
Where is the money?
So Rafe, on that, is that not a fair point? If we could find some way, I know it's probably the practicalities of this are difficult, admittedly, but if we could find some way to go, well, look, your great-great-great-grandfather was enslaved, taken from Africa. used as a laborer. That labor produced X amount of wealth, and we are now, we've developed this magical system to trace that back and to be able to give you X% of his labor. Would that not be a good thing to do?
No, not at all, because you're talking about sums that are far smaller than what you're discussing here. But also, of course, there is no, don't have such a rosy-colored picture of what it was like in Africa for slaves. Just in the kingdom of Dahomey, you had annual sacrifices where you had up to 4,000 slaves murdered in human sacrifice rituals that were done there.
What about Islam doesn't get us anywhere?
It's not at all.
This is literally
You talk about the Islamics. No, but you're trying to paint this picture that somehow slavery, there are different gradations of slavery. In the Islamic slave trade, you had millions of young boys were captured. 60% of those millions of young boys died because they were castrated brutally, without anesthetic, of course, and died from that. This idea that somehow they were walking about drinking mint tulips or whatever.
Nobody said that.
Yes, you did, actually.
No, I said it was different. I didn't say it was good. So let's just be clear what I said. I said it was different.
Yeah, I hear that. That is what you said. But
if you're going to create your formula, then who's going to pay for this? Out of a population of millions of people, there were only a few thousand slave owners. The majority of British people in this country descend from people who lived lives of abject poverty akin to serfdom. Why should their tax money go to paying reparations? Over 16% of this country is now foreign born. Why should somebody who was born in Malaysia or Korea pay reparations? What about Jamaicans living here now? Why should they pay tax money to people in Trinidad for reparations? I mean, the whole idea is absurd. As I say, you can't have intergenerational trauma for 8 generations. It's simply absurd. You need to take responsibility and, of course, look to the great success stories of Africa in the past. Look, for example, there are reasons for Africa's poverty right now, and it's corruption, it's a failure to manage the economy well. There are only 2 countries in Africa which are success stories that rank in the top tier of the Human Development Index. That's Mauritius and the Seychelles. Why is that? Because they've got good government, good democracy, they have institutions that are respected and well supported, and they've allowed immigration into the country. So there are lots of Indians in the economy who are helping the economy. Contrast that to what happened to South Africa. Contrast that to what happened with Zimbabwe.
So why would this in Africa? With the white minority rules in Africa.
With Zimbabwe, look at the economy. As soon as you turf out one group of
we need non-black people in Africa as a solution. The amount of actual racist ideas coming out.
Racist ideas. Are you denying
You're
that
just telling us that we need non-Africans in Africa is the wise better?
What happened to Uganda after the Asian Indians? After the Asians
what happened to Uganda before?
Out?
What happened to Uganda before?
What happened to South Africa?
What happened to South Africa before?
In recent years? What's happened to Zimbabwe?
South Africa again. Let's not lie. South Africa is not kicking people out. That's not what's happening at all. South Africa is actually still under the control of most of the same Afrikaners. Let's not lie.
The corruption. I'm talking about the corruption. The failure
where does
to
the
deal with
corruption
all
come
of that.
from? I'm sorry.
And you talk
let's talk about the Congo.
And you talk about Africa. For example, that life expectancy in Africa, you said, is 60. It doubled because of the arrival of the Europeans in the country. Life expectancy for thousands of years had been 24 to 35. Up to the 1850s, 1860s. It was the same in 1850 as in 1550, as in 1450. Since Europeans arrived, because of medicine, vaccinations, antibiotics, clean water, sanitation, life expectancy doubled. And the Caribbean was a beneficiary of far more of that. Life expectancy in the Caribbean is up to 15 years longer than in West Africa. The GDP is over 10 times higher. That's because of the inheritance that they got from the British Empire.
But that is, can I just be really, really clear on this? I think one of the things which gets lost also with reparations for slavery campaigns is the good ones are not just about slavery. It actually says, so America, for example, has a whole slavery reparations campaign, which recognizes slavery, recognizes Jim Crow, recognizes everything else. As I said, the knife wasn't pulled out. So when you're looking at someone like Africa, slavery happens, then colonialism happens. So Africa is literally underdeveloped by Europe. So anything you say about the life expectancy was bad, it was underdeveloped.
Can I just get...
It wasn't developed before.
Hold on.
But this is the...
I want to let you talk for a long time. There's just a definition I'd love to get from you, because it's a word we hear a lot now, colonialism. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? What is colonialism?
So colonialism is when one country or entity controls another one for its own benefit. Mm. And so Jamaica is a colony of Britain from 1655. Everything that happens in Jamaica is... You could still argue today because we now have neo-colonialism, but colonialism, everything happens in Jamaica, everything happens in Nigeria when it's colonized, it's to the benefit of Britain. And so therefore places are underdeveloped. So the truth is we have no idea what would happen if Europe hadn't come into Africa, did the slave trade, the colonialism. We have no idea what happened.
Rafe, is that not a fair point?
Developed.
No, we do know.
Don't know what happened. No, you don't.
We do. We have Ethiopia and we have Liberia. Ethiopia and Liberia were never colonized. They were independent. They were independent. They were independent nations. And I'm sorry, but Ethiopia and Liberia still remain in the lowest tier of developed countries in Africa.
Rafe, it's my mistake. I shouldn't have brought Rafe in. I apologize. You carry on.
Liberia is actually made up by America, so let's not pretend that Liberia has this long history. Ethiopia is the perfect example of being a country surrounded by other colonial countries. So Ethiopia may well have been independent, but a country can't by itself develop. If it's surrounded by, it's basically a colony. And actually Ethiopia is one of the, in terms of what we call neo-colonialism there, which is after formal colonialism ends, yes, you have governments, but they are puppet governments. In fact, many times installed by the West, and that's where the corruption actually comes from, not us, from puppet governments. And you cannot, I mean, that would be just a lie to pretend that's not the case. For example, in the Congo, Joseph Mobutu is literally installed by the CIA and puppets, and then literally destroys the country. And it comes to England, comes to America, flies around in private jets and steals billions upon billions upon billions with the consent of both the USA and the United Kingdom and Europe, etc. So the neocolonialism is when we have that. It continues. So I'd argue actually Ethiopia is one of the worst countries for neocolonialism because it was surrounded by everywhere else. So the point is, don't just look at slavery as separate. Look at that history and tell me anywhere on this line, from slavery to colonialism to neocolonialism or racism, where has this debt that you say and acknowledge should have been paid, where has it been paid? And not only has it not been paid, more things have been piled onto it. Third world debt, for example, piled onto it. All of these things piled onto it. So we actually have a position where it's far worse than just slavery. It's slavery, colonialism, and where we are today, because it just piles up. And to pretend that it doesn't, that's what I call psychosis, the psychosis of whiteness. There's this rosy-eyed view of the world where you can ignore what's happened historically, ignore the implications, which are very clear today. And I've got a question for Rafe. So my argument is very clear. White supremacy is what defines the global economy. Has done since, this is a very clear argument. If you look at a map of global inequality today, GDP per capita, it will show you that the poorest part of the world is where black people live, so-called sub-Saharan Africa. The richest part of the world is where white people live, the West, and there's a hierarchy in between. So we literally have an economy in the mode of white supremacy, which is this is how I understand the world. Tell me how that can be true. Well, if it's not.
Rafe, before you do, can I just jump in?
Please don't, because I'd like to know.
Can I just explore this thing? Because you say the psychosis of white, and look, I think you've made some interesting points about, slavery and what's owed. And, I actually said to you before we started that I think there's some really strong arguments on that point that I agree with to some extent. Well, when you start talking about whiteness, are you not including a hell of a lot of people who really had nothing to do with any of this? Like my ancestors are Russian. That's where I'm from. I happen to live in this country, but when you say psychosis of whiteness, now I'm part of this somehow. Do you see what I'm saying?
I want to
is it not a little bit, too broad? If you're someone who values free inquiry and independent thinking, which let's be honest, is why you're probably watching Trigonometry, then our sponsor, Venice AI, is the tool for you. Here's a hot take. AI is exploding right now. But seriously, most of the tools out there are just clones with slightly different skins. Venice AI is different. It offers uncensored AI chat, images, and coding. Why should a team of programmers at these leading AI apps be the ones who get to decide what is and isn't okay for you to think? Whether you're researching topics that make other platforms nervous, or you're just sick of being told what you can and can't ask, Venice gives you the freedom to explore without limits. No political filtering, no condescending footnotes, just powerful AI, fast. We've tried it ourselves, and if you're someone who thinks about these things, you'll notice the difference immediately. If you want to use AI without fear of handing over your thoughts, ideas, or personal information to a corporation or the government, you can get 20% off a pro plan using our link, venice.ai/trigonometry. You'll find the link in the description of this episode, or type it in, venice.ai/trigonometry, and see what you've been missing. And now, back to the show.
Whiteness is about idea, not people. So it's not about people. So I didn't say psychosis of white people. I said whiteness. Whiteness is a way of viewing the world which is completely irrational, deluded, and distorted, and leads to arguments like on the other side of the table, which all black people, Asian people are just as likely to engage in as anybody else. It's not about you individually.
Wait, so whiteness has nothing to do with skin color?
But it's whiteness comes from a system of white supremacy. As I said, the world today is it. Can you explain why the poorest part of the world is black and the richest part of the world is white, and there's a hierarchy in between?
Well,
that isn't about race, isn't about colonialism.
Maybe Rafe wants to have a
The
go.
poorest part of the world was African long before Europeans arrived. How do you explain that?
Africa was ahead of Europe before. Africa was ahead
Sub-Saharan
of Europe before.
Look, you had in the Middle Ages, you had the Mali Empire and and Timbuktu and all of that.
Ahead of Europe.
Yeah, but they didn't develop beyond that. Why is that? Why was Sub-Saharan?
Because slavery happened.
No, I'm
Of course it
sorry.
is.
For heaven's sake, we're talking about West African slavery. That didn't go into Central Africa.
Where did they get
when
the-
we're
Well,
talking
let
about,
him answer now, yeah?
All right,
Can we answer with the truth,
Yeah,
and not
well,
make
I'm
things
sorry. I mean, this is the key point, right? Africa is thousands of years old. Europeans didn't arrive there to settle and colonize until the scramble for Africa was when it really took place in 1885. As late as 1841, you had a few trading outposts on the coast. Yes, there was a slave trade, but we're talking about when Europeans went inland, because people inland in Africa didn't have any knowledge or experience of what was happening on the coast
did
and
they
the
get their
slave
slave
markets,
from? Let him answer.
right? Africa is huge. They got their slaves from West Africa. They weren't getting their slaves from Central Africa.
Congo, where's Congo?
No, I'm talking about the 1600s and
Where's
the
Congo?
and the
Congo.
16.
Come on.
I am giving you plenty of time. I know you're both passionate, and I love it, and it's great. And I'm just Rafe, one sec. I'm glad we're having this debate. I think it's great. I want it to be informative for the audience as well. So it's better if you don't talk over each other. You will get all the time you need, both of you. All right.
In 1871, only 10% of Africa had been colonized. So why in 1871, Africa had thousands of years, why was there no equivalent of the cities of, this is a landmass larger than Europe, larger than India and China combined. Why wasn't there the economic development? Why was life expectancy still as it was? Why didn't you have any of the scientific advancement and elsewhere? Africa had been left to its own devices. It didn't come up with that. The huge leap forwards for Africa in terms of life expectancy, in terms of the economy, in terms of science and medicine, happened when the Europeans were there. And the Europeans were not there for very long. I think people often think that this is centuries of involvement in Africa. We're talking about a period of around 150 years ago was when colonization started. And for most countries, colonization was less than a century. It was from the 1880s up to the 1950s or 1970s. Such a short period of time. But during that period, what growth and development happened in Africa, for example. Now, this is really going to annoy Kehinde, but nothing has done more to lift the world out of poverty than capitalism and colonialism. Those have been the two greatest forces for life expectancy, for living standards. As Steven Pinker from Harvard University has said, that the life in pre-state societies was incalculably more brutal and harsh than life today. I mean, we're talking about cannibalism, awful rituals taking place, everything, and you needed structured societies to achieve that. That's been achieved. If you look at the successful states that achieved that, they were ones that usually had a British imperial heritage. So wherever you go in the world, of all the empires, those that had a British imperial heritage came out the best of the whole situation. And you talk about Jamaica, for example, Jamaicans disagree with you. And, a few years ago, there was a poll of Jamaicans, 60% of Jamaicans said that they wished the British had never left. They said British rule was far better, it was far less corrupt, things worked better, and they would prefer the British to be in power. And if you look, and you were asking about, you said I can't cite any examples, if you look at the independent countries in the Caribbean, yes, a lot of them aren't doing very well economically. The countries in the Caribbean that are doing very well are those which are dependencies of France, of Britain, and of the United States. Puerto Rico, Guadeloupe, Martinique, around the same size as Puerto Rico, as Barbados, much more profitable. Why? Because they haven't been victims of the corruption and of the incompetent leadership, the substandard and unserious politicians that you have there, who are often beating the drum and looking for handouts rather than dealing with the country's problems as they should be dealt with.
So
You got all the time you want.
I literally just explained this, which is why Tobias like psychosis, because you give the argument and then just
Come on, you've got to stop throwing insults and just make the argument.
I want to be clear. It's not an insult. It's not an insult.
I tell you, our
This is
audience
about
is
not an insult.
very nuanced. and they're open to be persuaded, but you've got to make the argument.
But I want to stress this is part of the argument, because part of what I'm trying to tell you is it doesn't matter what we say and we talk about debate and you want to come to it's not going to happen, right? Because we're
Well,
talking.
you two are never going to agree. That's why you're here. But hold on. You're coming at this from two very different perspectives. But the reason I brought you together is not because I thought you and Rafe would sit down around the table and eventually agree. That's never going to happen. The reason I brought you together is there's 1.5 million people watching potentially, right? And a lot of them haven't made their mind up about this issue at all. They don't know, as I don't know, what they think. So you have an opportunity to persuade them. So the reason I say the word insult, maybe you don't mean it that way, but if you say to the person watching this, well, you've got psychosis, it's not that persuasive. Do you know what I mean?
I'm just making it plain. Like, I don't know how else to tell you, but to make it plain.
Persuade me, explain it to me.
But look, as I said, the idea that, so Rafe starts up with this point, which I already mentioned, right? Colonialism. The reason that Europe doesn't colonize Africa is it can't. It's not because it doesn't want to. It's not possible. It doesn't have the capability.
But his argument is Africa was poor before the Europeans got there.
And this is where it's simply not true. When Europe comes to Africa, Africa is ahead. There are more books in Timbuktu, one library in Timbuktu, than there are in the whole of Europe. This is one of the biggest lies of history. Africa is not behind. Europe can't actually colonize Africa because it doesn't have the capability to do it. It's not possible. All right?
Is that just one example, or are you saying the whole continent is more developed?
I mean, not every part of the continent, but if you're going to say Africa as a whole is more developed.
Well, we're quite ignorant about African history, I would say. So can you tell us more about that?
Generally, you're talking about the Mali Empire, you're talking about technologically, in terms of reading, it's just ahead. There's no doubt
Technologically.
Like what
when
the Moors go into Europe from North Africa, and bring in things like many things, toilet paper, bring in things like hygiene, bring in things like dinner plates. You can talk, and you know this is true, right? I'm not making this up. There's a whole influence on European culture from the Moors. When the Moors are defeated in 1491, 1492, that opens up Europe and coming to Africa. But Africa as a whole is just not, they're not able to colonize.
Are the Moors, I'm not a historian, so I don't know. So again, educate me. Are the Moors North Africans, or are they coming from sub-Saharan Africa?
This is North Africa. This is the North African.
So
you also have Mali. You have you mentioned the Empire of Mali. You have Zimbabwe has development. Overall, but Africa is not behind.
The Moors are part of the Islamic world, right? The North Africans part.
They also include Africa as well, right? We agree on this.
It's not just about sub-Saharan Africa, because Africa's too big.
It's why I'm asking. The slave trade. So when I think what people hear, or at least what I hear, I may be wrong. When you say Africa was more advanced, I'm trying to think.
I'm not just talking about the Moors. The Moors are one part.
Okay. So let's set the Moors aside.
Mali is not the Moors. Mali and Empire. Zimbabwe, the Yoruba. You can go through. The continent is not like some backwards. We're not doing anything on the continent.
So when you say they're more advanced, you talked about the Moors brought certain things, which by the way, like a lot of people don't know. I actually studied Islamic history at university, so I know a lot of the things that they brought and preserved sometimes from the ancient world, etc. But in terms of the sub-Saharan Africa, what would you say were their key scientific developments and other things that we would say, well, that was more advanced than the Europeans at that point?
Well, it's actually interesting that there's actually reports that when Columbus was sailing to America, there were Africans sailing back. Not Moors, West Africans. There's actually a lot of evidence that West Africans made it to America long before, 1,000 years before.
Right.
The Olmec heads. There was a person who did the research, I can't remember her name. New Age of Empire is a book where I did the research on this. But she actually found that there were drugs in some of the West African, there were drugs in the Latin American tombs, which came from West Africa, 1,000 years ago. So it's just simply
they had sailing technology.
They could sail, they had the wheel, they could do, there was technology, there was iron, etc. Remember, we're in the Dark Ages in Europe. Like, Europe isn't particularly advanced at all at this point. So the reason why Rafe is correct, Europe goes to Africa really 1492, 15th century, 16th century, right? The reason they're not colonizing isn't because they don't want to colonize, because they can't. You mentioned it earlier. Why was it that there was Africans who did the actual capture? Because Europeans couldn't get in.
I thought that's because it was disease.
It wasn't just disease. It wasn't just disease. It was revolt. It was rebellion. It was the fact that they had this disease. Does not explain why you have these massive castles. Were heavily fortified, and even like Elmina Castle in Ghana, was now Ghana, they even abandon those and have to go. At some point, they start just having boats where the boats are offshore because there's so much resistance. They just start putting people on the boats. So there's a reason why Europe was. It's not because they don't want to.
They didn't need to. The slave markets were there on the coast.
I'm not making this up. New Age of Empire. I did the research. So let me explain. So slavery, once Europeans started to come in to enslave, and a big part of this whole thing as well, when we say Africans, that is a European idea at the time. At the time, Africans did not see themselves as Africans. That was not the case. There was different ethnicities, and what Europe did very well was they played off these different ethnicities against each other. So it wasn't the case that the Yoruba were selling the Yoruba. The Yoruba might have a war with the Igbo, and then when they captured the Igbo, they'd sell it. So the idea that Africans are selling other Africans, again, is not really true. This is different.
Well, no, hold on. That's what this one group of Africans selling another group of Africans.
We now think of Africans, and they now think of Africans certainly. But at the time, if there was a "we are all African" identity, slavery probably doesn't happen because again, Europe's not powerful enough. So what happens is slavery starts, it becomes lucrative. It slowly starts to become the dominant. It is the dominant force on the African continent. And yes, the enslaved are taken from the interior. There are marches. Congo is one of the main places where enslaved go to Brazil. That's firmly in the middle. So the whole continent starts to change, which is why you have the rise of the Ashanti, the Dahomey who you mentioned, the groups that say, actually, no, we will do this, we'll do the trading on behalf of, we'll work. They have the English flag, some of these.
You're saying demand creates supply?
Yes,
okay.
they sold because it was lucrative, right? And so there were people who took advantage, and this completely, and if you look at all of the ethnic groups that become dominant, those are the ones that are enslaving. And they're doing it oftentimes with the English flag, literally waving the English flag, enslaving people. So there's a whole period from let's say 1500 up to colonization, where Africa's being drained of resources, slavery is destroying things, people are moving away from, they're trying to get away from the coast. The whole economy gets shaped, completely differently shaped. So we have no idea what happens because slavery becomes a dominant thing on the continent, which is why there's no development. Slavery literally stops African development to the point at which then in the 19th century, places like Nigeria are they can be colonized. And again, just the idea that places with British heritage are the ones who do the best. Nigeria is essentially a failed state. Explain that. Because Nigeria had British, it's still very British education system, and it's it's essentially a failed state today. So it's really not the case that having British heritage makes it the world.
Most regions of the world, places with a British heritage are better. South Africa was the golden jewel in Africa. Kenya was the great.
Kenya?
I know.
Kenya's deeply poor.
I'm sorry. I'm talking about when independence came. I'm not talking about what's happened. You can't blame us now for the bad corruption and bad government of those places.
That's not true.
But if you compare African states that were British to those that were French or elsewhere, but let's get back to your point. Look, I've already said, and you said that the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire were great, but don't make it out as if there was a great Wakanda in Africa at this time. I'm sorry. These are few and far between places. The history of the reason for their decline was because of internal issues that they had. They were warring with each other. They were incompetently led. That's why you had the collapse of Timbuktu and of the Mali Empire, for example. And why was it? I mean, the fact is, Africa was not developed. Why did Africa not have something equivalent to the Enlightenment that we saw and to the Reformation that we saw in the 13th to the 17th century in Italy and Europe, the great cultural awakening of the Reformation? Why didn't they have an equivalent to the Gupta Empire in India, where you saw a great flourishing of arts and culture and science? Why was there no equivalent to the Tang dynasty in China, the great period there? This was a time when there was no European entry into Africa. This was a time when Africa was on its own, able to do whatever it wanted to. It had the opportunity to develop its own culture. 80% of African languages don't have a written alphabet. It's very difficult, therefore, to create a civilized society when you don't have those necessary precursors for civilizations. Those are the things, of course, which you don't want to address. And it's very easy to just suggest that Africa was somehow more developed. I'm sorry. The point was,
well, he did say
the history of.
I said it was more developed than Europe.
Asia, India, China, the Middle East were much more advanced than Europe in the Dark Ages and elsewhere. Absolutely. What happened, the great genius of the West, is what happened from the 1600s onwards, when we adopted the scientific method, and when, as I said, the Western mind fundamentally views the world differently. For example, outside of the West, they're much better at facial recognition because they use both hemispheres of the brain. The Western mind only uses the right hemisphere for facial recognition. There are very fundamentally different ways in which these things happen.
It's just eugenics nonsense.
It's not eugenics because you now find it in places
white
like
people's
China.
mind. Listen to what you say, not the West. Let's replace West with white, because that's what you actually mean. Let's be real. White people's minds function differently. Who lives in
Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. These were born in. These were born in Europe, but they've now been processed in China, in Japan, in other industrialized parts of the
The
world.
origin of it was white. I'm correct.
Oh, well, you're very happy to celebrate the African origins of things. Somehow Europe can't celebrate or acknowledge any of its own achievements and accomplishments.
You can celebrate the achievements, but don't pretend the Western mind is different. The white
It
mind
is.
is different.
Well,
That's a clearly
you
racist idea.
You clearly haven't done any
How is
research.
that? It's not true.
okay.
I don't.
Loads of psychological evidence.
Loads of eugenic evidence that tells you this.
No,
of course.
hold on,
That's
but come on.
It's nothing to do with eugenics.
Yes. It's 100% different.
There are different groups of white people, right? The only reason I'm jumping in is because you're talking about something that I personally can weigh in on. So I would say, having come from Eastern Europe, there's a massive difference between the way Eastern Europeans think and the way Western Europeans think, or the way Americans think. In fact, there's actually, as I've now discovered, I used to think like Americans and British people basically the same, speak the same language. As you've just come back from America, you know that's not true, right? Like they think about things very differently. So if cultures can be different within, you're focused on ethnicity, okay, let's just take that. White people can have different cultures.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be therefore very logical to say people in Western Europe will have a different way of thinking about things than people in another continent, whether that's in China or in Africa? Isn't that a fair point? Why do you say that's eugenics? It seems like excessive to me.
You can certainly make the case that there's different cultural outlooks. Of course, there are. African beliefs tend to have completely different views about death, etc. But that is a different state that the Western mind is different. Our minds are the same. Our cultures may be different, but our minds are not different. And actually, I really want to stress this.
They are fundamentally.
That
is Western
when you start to
exceptionalism.
put it in the whole thing of eugenics, craniometry, there's a different kind of sight. You can measure the head. You can say which is the right
different.
brain.
He didn't say brain.
This
He
is
said
not
mind.
This is not biological.
So why is it? So
Westerners, for example,
please explain why what you're saying. This is not me. The Western mind has a different hemisphere when white.
Okay, let him explain.
Why is that the case?
Let him explain.
Me what's the case.
Spatial awareness, visual reasoning, these are all noticeable differences. So, for example, right corners, we are less good at looking at round corners than Africans because they don't have the right angle. So if you look in places now that were built, when you grow up in houses which are square, the eye naturally sees right angles when they see a flat surface.
But why is
they
it
don't see that.
I'm asking why.
That's because of how we developed and grow up. This is about cultural anthropology. It's not about biology. This is about the situation and the dynamics. I'm sorry.
We're dressing up eugenics as
very respected historians.
Question.
And as the West developed, and as you had colonialism, and you exported the Western concepts around the world, you saw the development of these same attributes elsewhere, which is why, of course, you had in Japan and China, there are very few differences now with the originally European mind, which is why it's called the Western mind. This is not something that's controversial. This is accepted by behavioral psychologists and cultural psychologists and anthropologists. It's very well known. This is the science.
I have a degree in psychology, so I can tell you it's not generally accepted.
Actually, it is. There's a lot of evidence. But the point is, it was that moment, and this all goes back to the church's ban on cousin marriage 1,000 years ago. This is where it all develops from. The Catholic Church, it was then called the Western Church, banned marriage between certain degrees of consanguinity. That got rid of the kinship clans, which were prevalent all around the world. To this day, the majority of cultures in the world have large kinship-based families with about 40, 50 members. Whether you're a first, second, third, fourth cousin, you're treated equally as brothers and sisters. That was done away with in Europe, and so suddenly you had the birth of the nuclear family. And still, nuclear families are a small minority of global families. And what you had then was you had family units that had to rely on other people for support. You got the birth of social trust. Social trust did not exist outside of the West at this time to anywhere near the same degree. When you had social trust, of course, you then were able to enter into contracts, and you began to have rival organizations to families developing. You had charter towns that you would sign an oath to help develop. You had universities, you had guilds, you had confraternities. These were uniquely European things that began to develop in the last 1,000 years. And then when you had these independent organizations, you then began to have cross-pollination of ideas. They would talk and discuss, you'd have the birth of competition, and that's what led to innovation. And social trust and competition are fundamental to innovation. And it's at this point that you see the development of a very different worldview, a very different outlook. And you can see it in all sorts of ways. So, for example, if you look at ways that we identify ourselves for the Western people, and that includes now modern places in Asia. If I say, Konstantin, who are you? You'd say, I'm a very, very handsome stand-up comedian.
You're trying to get on my side.
I've got snazzy jackets, and I collect milk bottle tops or whatever, right? But if you were to ask somebody in a tribe in rural Africa, they would say, well, I'm X, I'm the son of Y, I'm the brother of so-and-so, I'm the father of so-and-so.
And that's what
it's family and kinship that defines who you are, as opposed to what happens in the West. Because in the West, you had the birth of individualism. And that was the key difference. The notion of the individual is a Western, primarily Anglospheric concept, which also Protestant helped to create. And it was that notion of the individual and self-improvement and the reliance on other people. That you had innovation and individualism and competition. That led to the uniqueness of the Western mind, which wasn't replicated anywhere else till you had an exporting of colonialism.
See, the reason I'm getting I don't even know. Now I'm just starting to be like, this is actually dangerous. Like, these are a set of dangerous ideas. So if you think about what justified slavery in the first place, first you had to do was a religious justification. It was very much the Pope. You're Christian. If you're not Christian, you're a heathen. You can do what you like, right? After that, it becomes the Enlightenment definition, the scientific definition. Actually, we're just not human beings, right? We're just actually I'm more like an ape than I am a human. Therefore, you can do X, Y, Z. Again, I would point out this Enlightenment that we're so proud of was actually brought in the idea that I'm not a human being. So maybe there's some very bad ideas in the Enlightenment. Anyway, it becomes that scientific justification. That's where you get phrenology, eugenics, which I'm saying why this is a eugenic idea. What happens after the Second World War is eugenics becomes a bad thing. We can't do eugenics no more. What do? We do cultural racism. So you're explaining the world because you're saying that the West essentially has a better culture and that Africa has a backwards culture, and this is why Africa's poor. You go from church, science, culture, it's the same line. So when I'm saying it's eugenics. It's just eugenics dressed up in something else, which you can do with some fancy tests and which are not, and I promise you, these things are not widely accepted in psychology. I have a degree in psychology. I know it's literature. It is deeply controversial. And I would ask your audience to think, it's a comforting idea to think that the poverty that we have, a world that kills a child every 10 seconds because they haven't got access to food and water. Most of those children, probably all of those children, are black and brown. Racial capitalism. It's comforting to think it's because we have this great culture, isn't it wonderful, etc., etc. But I'm giving you the actual alternative reality to this. There is a reason why Africa's development stops when slavery starts. Because slavery stops the development. There is a reason why under colonialism, where the whole economy is dictated to and to draw out resources. So when African countries get independence, a book I would recommend everybody read is Africa Must Unite by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Ghana is actually one of the first countries, 1960, to get independence. Says, now I run this country, but there's no hospitals, there's no schools, there's no roads, there's no factories. In fact, the whole of this economy is built on taking all of our resources and processing them in Europe and selling them back to us. That is still the case in somewhere like Ghana, where chocolate companies take the resources, produce it outside, etc., etc. So when you have this independence happens, how could a country that has no hospitals, no roads, no factories ever succeed? It can't. So what does it do? It falls into poverty, gets these loans, has more poverty, etc., etc. On top of that, one of the key features of neocolonialism is to install puppet governments, places like Congo, even in Nigeria, even in Nkrumah is ousted, etc. And so when you're looking at African countries can't succeed, of course they couldn't succeed. There's no possible way that they could have succeeded, which is why they're still poor today. And again, reparations is not just about slavery, it's about that whole history. So I'm telling you, the reason that you have this inequality today is very clearly, largely down to Europe exploiting, the West exploiting the underdeveloped world, and it's continuing to do so. And you have a fairy tale and frankly racist idea over there because it's a better culture.
Pause both of you. Is it possible that there's some truth in what you're both saying? Because I think it's undeniable that Western slavery and colonialism would have had a negative impact on Africa, but that doesn't mean that the cultures were necessarily the same. So could it be that you're both right? I mean, Rafe, surely you wouldn't deny that colonialism and slavery was bad for Africa, would you?
Yeah, well, for people alive at the time, it was bad, absolutely. That's my point. Slavery and colonialism were horrendous for people at the time, but now, generation on, I'm sorry, the benefits of colonialism have helped to lift the world out of poverty, have increased life, have doubled life expectancy. Same thing in Australia. Life expectancy of Aborigines was 40 years for thousands of years. Now it's almost doubled, right? So those are the advantages. So yes, slavery was horrendous for slaves, but for the descendants of slaves today living in Britain and the Caribbean, slavery, they're not victims of slavery. They've actually benefited from the terrible hardship that their ancestors went through.
But do you not think being occupied, having a foreign government that sought to use your country exclusively for its own benefit, which it did, and I'm not saying they didn't do certain things, I'm sure they brought schools in and whatever, but nonetheless, they did that so they had a more educated population to do the things that they needed done, right? Don't you think that, 100 years of that would leave a legacy that was detrimental?
Detriment in what way? Yes, look, the point was the pre-state societies were far more brutal. So yes, I'm not saying that these were wonderful places necessarily to live, but racism was abhorrent at that time. Look, Britain is now the world's third least racist country, but back in the 19th century, of course, everyone did believe in racial hierarchies. Britain was very racist in the start of the 20th century as well. No one is denying that. No one is denying the atrocities. My father was born in Kenya, along with all his family. What happened to the Mau was terrible, and everything else, and the Kikuyu and so forth. But the point was, terrible compared to what? The conditions that were there before, when you had terrible violence, of course, between rival tribes, you had warfare, you had malnutrition, you had poor water, you had disease, people's life expectancies were so short. You compare that to what happened afterwards, clearly a huge improvement with the benefit of industrialization and development. And of course, once independence came, they were given an inheritance. They had the necessary conditions to thrive. I mean, it's not true. In the 1950s and 60s was, for example, in the Caribbean, that was a key era for the development of the Caribbean. In Barbados, there's only one main hospital that was built by the British, one main university that was built by the British. Things haven't developed beyond that in Barbados because, of course, there's been economic mismanagement and corruption. And as I've said to you before, the countries in the Caribbean that are still crown dependencies are the ones that are thriving. 60% of Jamaicans understand that, and they would prefer Britain never to have left.
Let me answer that specifically. As I said, this is what we call neo-colonialism. So when Jamaica becomes independent, and actually the reason Jamaica becomes independent is to stop Jamaicans migrating to Britain. That is why they made Jamaica independent, not because of some great moral thing. It's they want to stop people coming, and it largely works. But after Jamaica becomes independent, this is the problem with independence. It's independence in theory, but the economics of Jamaica stay the same. So the same people who owned everything in Jamaica still own it now. So the money is still being taken out, still being withdrawn, which is why obviously it can't succeed. Jamaica's economy is really collapsing and doesn't really show any signs of getting much better. And so yes, if you ask your average Jamaican, was it better under the British? They might go, yeah, it was a bit better. But that's because they're presented with this neo-colonialism, which is even worse. But the cause of it is still the same. We still have to address it. So for example, no, in Jamaica, and I know Jamaica well, I'm from Jamaica. Tourism is the main industry, right? 70% of the money from tourism goes straight out. There's the North Shore, where my family live in Jamaica, most of it, literally, there's like no public beaches, or like a little slither of public beaches, because most of it's owned by foreign companies. So the thing that's supposed to help us doesn't help us. It just drains the money straight out. That's the problem with something like Jamaica. It's not actually independent. It's theoretically independent, but economically, Jamaica's economy is still completely being rinsed by the West. And now it's not just actually Europe, it's also China, India's getting involved, et cetera, et cetera. So Jamaica's economy can't work. And so the people there might say, oh yeah, we want it was better then. But that's not proof.
Okay, you're acting as if the Jamaican government has no agency in any of this.
Oh, that was terrible. Don't get me wrong.
It's the same thing.
Not back in Jamaica.
But this is the problem here that you have. That's why people preferred things when they were run by the British. In Barbados, the Auditor General in Barbados has said that he can't actually get proper accounts for state-owned industries and enterprises. Can you imagine that? The Auditor General cannot get accounts on state industries in Barbados. That's the level of corruption and dysfunction that is created by having people in power who simply don't deserve to be there. And you can't keep blaming everything on what happened post-independence. It's now been 50, 60, 70 years of independence. That's long enough to sort your own house out.
Can I answer this question? Because the problem that you stated, what was one of the key things that Britain needed was financial stability. And the former colonies simply don't have it because they can't have it. Because no, Britain did not leave the colonies in a state where they could govern. They did not. That's factually untrue. They left the colonies in states with roads that went to the airport, with maybe one hospital, maybe a couple of schools. They did not leave them in places where they could succeed, which is why most of the former colonies, almost all of them, fall into what we call third world debt, IMF, et cetera, which is just a new form of colonialism. That's the truth. That's as fundamentally the truth.
No country did more to prepare its colonies for independence than Britain
deeply
did.
untrue.
And up to 2009, you had Britain invested. The civil service was present, military structures, parliament, courts, the judiciary, the rule of law.
I'm talking about roads, infrastructure, hospitals. They didn't, because the evidence is clear on this.
Of course, you look at the number of schools, and I mean, for example, even after emancipation. So after slavery was abolished in 1833, enforced in 1844, for the next 10 years, from 1835 to 1844, with no obligation, Britain gave grants to the Caribbean for schools, for churches, and for hospitals and so forth, some equivalent to £1 billion today, right?
Sorry, can we say no obligation? This is again a massive problem when we think about Britain. The Jamaica was a colony of Britain. It had an obligation. When my dad came in 1960 to here, he came with a passport.
Loans,
wait a second. No, they came with a passport that said Jamaica. It had every obligation because it owned the place. The idea was
I think you've got your wires crossed. I think what Rafe is saying is the money was given and there was no requirement to repay or to do anything in exchange.
No, my point is it was part of the nation, so of course it was. There's no difference between Britain funding education in Jamaica and Britain funding education in Birmingham.
And the Caribbean still benefits because it's a member of the Commonwealth.
We should be grateful for it.
Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK given an inordinate amount of its foreign aid to former British colonies in the Commonwealth, right? So, as I said, $2 billion up to 2009. Currently, it's £430 million of British money is earmarked for development there, and that's because, of course, of the ties of being members of the Commonwealth.
All right. We're back in nerd territory. I want to wrap it up a little bit but Kehinde, can I ask you one thing? Before we wrap up, because you talked a lot about this kind of psychology of whiteness and whatever. Do you think there was something very particular about Western Europeans that made them do the slave trade, that made them behave in the ways that they did?
That's a good question. Talk about different minds. Yeah, maybe that's why the different.
Do you have a theory on
what bad thing? Then you're happy with it.
Well, there we go. Different minds. I would not say different minds.
No, but I'm asking you, why do you think it happened that way? Because I guess the argument that I'm thinking about is, I personally have to say, I don't know enough about it to really make a judgment, but I'm surprised to hear you say Africa was more developed. I'd always assumed that the reason the Europeans did what they did probably wasn't because they had some different special mind in that way, but actually it was because they just had the technology, they were more powerful, they were wealthier, so they could do this in a way that actually everyone would have done if they were in a position to. So I guess what I'm getting at is, would Africans have colonized Western Europe if the shoe was on the other foot? Or do you think there's something special about white Europeans that made them behave in that way?
I'm so tempted to give a different answer to this question, but I'm really not. I'm gonna play nice.
Okay.
I think that when you look at it, this is why the West is. When I say the West, it really does mean going to the West. Europe going to the West and finding the Americas. The Americas is it unlocks so many things. It's not a coincidence that America is the richest part of the world. It's like that's the key that unlocks everything else.
Okay. And
I think you have to be honest and say, well, who's the ambassador to the guy Christopher Columbus, who goes over there, is one of the most violent, insidious people in the history of human life, right? And this is midpoint estimates, and this is all estimates, but the midpoint estimate of when he goes to Hispaniola, what's now Haiti and Dominican Republic, the midpoint estimate is he goes there and there's 8 million people. And this is the midpoint. It might be lower, it might be higher, I don't know, but the middle estimate. And that's 1492. When he eventually leaves in 1512, it's estimated that there are 20,000 people left. There's a huge decimation of life. When Europeans go because largely it's disease, but it's not just disease, it's man-eating dogs, it's working people to death. The genocide in the Americas generally is the largest genocide in human history. It's up to 65 million people. And I've read this and I was shocked. Apparently, the world actually cooled because so many people died, they were producing less greenhouse gas emissions and actually reduced the temperature of the earth. So if you think about the founding place for the West is the Americas, and how the West took over the Americas was the largest genocide in human history, a violence and disregard for life. And then where do they go to find the labor after they worked to death the natives? They go, we've got this African slave. Let's go and enslave Africans, turn them into non-humans.
Yeah.
Those are the two. So if you were to say, that barbarity, that anti-blackness, that racism, white supremacy, that's the difference. 100%. Okay. And that's what allows everything else to build.
So what I'm asking though is, do you think that if West Africans, let's say, they had the ships, they had the muskets, they had the gunpowder, they had the various different types of technology that enabled Western Europeans to go over to the Americas and do what you're talking about, right? Do you think that if the West African tribes, perhaps some of those more aggressive ones that enslaved other Africans, if they had all that technology and they went over to the Americas, do you think they would have behaved differently because of their different culture and background, or do you think they would have done the same thing?
I think evidence says they did behave differently. Like I said, there's evidence that the Africans were in the Americas at least 1,000 years before Europeans. So I think certainly the case would be that yes, there is a difference. Look,
why do you think that is?
I'm not going to sit here and speculate it's because there's something better about Africans. African have a superior morality. I don't look. There's.
But it's just like it's just the way that when you talk about whiteness, it's implied the way that white people think or white.
So I want to be clear here.
Okay.
That I am not. See, it would be very easy for me to sit here. Who's my favorite person? Malcolm X, right? Say, look, this is the devilish nature of the white man. It just shows, and people say that all the time, right?
Right.
I'm actually saying that whiteness is not about.
You don't agree with that?
No, I don't think all white people are devils.
Okay.
No, I don't.
Right.
I think that we can debate what could have happened, what may have happened, why it was, but the reality is that it was that carnage, that racial exploitation that was necessary to create the society we have, and that's why we have whiteness.
I'm not challenging.
I don't know. I can't tell you why, but I can tell you that is.
But what I'm asking you to think about for the purposes of this guy, I think it's really important to this discussion, right? Is you talk about whiteness. Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard to extricate that from white people. It's difficult for most people, at least, listen to this, right? And it's sort of implied within that the way whiteness operates is worse than the way other things operate, right? Mm-hmm. And what I'm asking you is, do you think if Africans had the same ability to dominate the native population of the Americas, would they have behaved the same or different?
All right, so yeah, I'll be clear on this. No, I think when I say whiteness is an idea, and that is an idea that has come from Western Europe.
Yeah,
that is an idea that has been used to dominate the world. That was a necessary feature of doing it because Africans went to the New World and didn't do this. So yes, there is something.
But they didn't
specific.
have the same technology.
Like I said, no.
They didn't have muskets and
as I said, when Europeans came in 40, they weren't massively more technologically advanced.
Oh, come on.
There's a reason why the Portuguese don't have slave plantations in Africa. They can't. They literally can't do it. So it's not the case that Europe first just comes into Africa able to control. It's not the case. It takes a long time to develop.
The jury's out on that, but let me come back. If they had the technology, of course they would have been the same. I mean, this idea that you didn't have terrible bloodshed happening and prejudice and the same sort of issues of racism happening within Africa. I mean, of course you did. If you look in the Central Africa, you had the Bantu were persecuting the Pygmies and killing them. If you look in Ethiopia, you had the Bantus themselves were the victims and being persecuted. In Somalia, the Abyssinians were murdering and hunting the Shankela, who are Nilotic Valley people. And this is not about white supremacy. I mean, when African slaves were taken to Islam, to the Arab world, they were regarded as the lowest social strata because the prejudice is there. Same thing with the Chinese and the Tang dynasty, who of course regarded African slaves as the Kunlun and were frightened by them. So this idea that something is unique to the West and unique to white people is simply not true. What is interesting, of course, is the exploration ethic of Europeans, which you don't find. Again, China had a massive fleet. Its ships were far better than European ships. It never discovered the Americas. You don't see the exploration that you saw within Europe, again, because of the distinction of the Western mind, and that whole concept of exploring and developing was very much fundamentally a European concept. You know, it's amazing, for example, it also goes down to individuality and the Anglosphere. So the first person to walk the length of the Nile was an Englishman, and that happened about 10 years ago. Imagine that, after all the thousands of years, the first person to walk the length of the Nile was an Englishman. First person to walk the length of the Amazon was an Englishman. Also, one second.
How do you know this?
Well, in recorded history.
So you don't know?
Well, I'm sorry. It would have been. We do have records
that you have,
yes.
But you actually don't know.
Well, nobody who was African or South American has done it, at least within the last 300 years of recorded history. And the first person to walk the length of the Yangtze was a Welshman, again around 10 years ago. Now that's in China with an ancient civilization. Why did no one from China think about walking the length of the Yangtze? First person to walk around the world and run around the world, American and English. Same thing with Everest and so forth. There is a uniqueness to the West in the idea of exploring and discovering, which you don't see elsewhere, and that's part of the reason why you develop.
So your point
empires.
is the British love a walk. I get it.
I do want to come back because I actually there is something specific about European rationality, which is the problem.
Tell me.
So there is when and I think and again, you don't believe me here, but you can't really separate whiteness from this. And so Descartes, I think therefore I am, is really I'm white and therefore I am. In fact, you've given this argument a bit today. There's something different about Europe, that we're not the natives, we're not Africans, we're not this, and that allows this separation of mind from body, which you actually don't see around most of the parts of the world. So African tends to be the
Chinese think they're different. The Japanese think they're very different.
Even with the Chinese, if you think about the relationship to the earth, you think about there's something about European rationality, the distancing of it, that allows. Not just with people, but with the world, with the earth, with look at the actual world is going to be destroyed by Europe, like literally going to be destroyed by
the Chinese thought they were superior to the whole rest of the world. They stopped developing because they thought they had reached peak civilization.
I'm not saying Chinese. This is not about superiority. Japanese thought superior.
Right.
I'm talking about the separation of mind from body. You don't see that in Chinese culture. There's a much more holistic version of what the person is. When you separate mind from body in that way, you can then distance yourself from certain atrocities in the way that we do. Like today. People, like 9 million people die from hunger today because of the West. And we're going to go, okay, the exploitation of the earth in a way that is actually going to literally destroy the earth. I agree, there's something unique about that in Western rationality, which is deeply problematic, which allows us to kill, to maim, to destroy the world.
And improve,
and actually going to end the world.
Do you know what? We were so close to a point of agreement there because you were both agreeing. And actually, maybe, I actually, there is something to what you're saying in the sense that everything has a trade-off, right? So it's possible that a particularly slightly more rationalistic way of thinking about it has some negative trade-offs and a lot of positive things about it.
Yeah.
It actually could be very possible that in some ways you're both right on this.
On that bombshell.
We've actually managed to get the two of you to agree. No, gentlemen, I actually have to say I really appreciate you both coming. I thought we had a very informative discussion. These debates often descend into stuff. I thought we strayed away from that as much as we could. We'll wrap up in a second, but perhaps you'd like both to take a couple of minutes just to sum up based on this conversation where, just the core of your argument once again for people as we wrap this up.
I mean, I'll finish where I started. There are no good arguments against reparations. It's been an interesting conversation, but the fact of this is clear. The knife in the back, it wasn't taken out. And if you can acknowledge that there should have been reparatory justice in 1838 or whatever, and that didn't take place, I just don't see how you can hold the argument that it should take place. There are clear economic consequences which still reverberate around the world from slavery, but not just slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's this huge gap in wealth and experience and life expectancy, not just life expectancy, but just life experience in general that needs to be addressed. And if we're serious about racial justice, the only way to do it is to, one, acknowledge it, and then two, address it. And that is going to need reparatory justice.
It is time the Caribbean nations and other communities look inwards and see what is it about our culture and our community we need to change. Stop this victimhood, learn about personal responsibility, take agency, improve your lot in life. We in Britain should be celebrating the fact that we were the first power to deliberately make itself poorer to advance a moral good. There are no living victims of British Empire slavery, and I think we need to move on from this chapter and understand that at its core, this is all about undermining Britain, America, and the West more broadly. This is not about slavery. If it was, people would be talking about modern slavery today in Africa with 10 million slaves. That's never spoken about, and surely the lives of people today are far more important. And the fact that that issue isn't even spoken about once in any article on this subject, I think speaks volumes about the true motivations behind a lot of those who are calling for reparations.
All right, well, I appreciate you both coming. Thank you for watching and listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others who you think might find it interesting. See you soon.